Hello, you're all very welcome to this talk. I'm delighted to be hosting today's discussion with Dr. Eli Merritt. My name is Donna Lyons, and this is seminar 26 in our speaker series. So many thanks to Eli for participating in this feature, and thank you all for watching. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our speaker. So Dr. Eli Merritt is a political historian at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Merritt has written about the dangers of demagogues to democracy for the New York Times, the LA Times, the Seattle Times, the Chicago Tribune, Newsday, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, among dozens of other news outlets. He writes a Substack newsletter called American Commonwealth that explores the origins of the United States political discontents, as well as solutions to them. Dr. Merritt completed his BA in history at Yale, his MA in ethics at Yale, his MD at Case Western Reserve, his internal medicine internship at the Lahey Clinic, and his psychiatry residency at Stanford. So it's a very impressive profile, and we're delighted to be talking to you today. Dr. Merritt is also the editor of The Curse of Demagogues, Lessons Learned from the Presidency of Donald J. Trump. And if you have a print copy of that, you might hold it up for us there, Dr. Merritt.
I will.
Great. Excellent.
I know you read the ebook, or
wonderful. I have. I've written I've read the PDF version. It's wonderful to see the print copy there. Thank you for anyone who wants to pick that up on Amazon. So that was published by Spotlight Press on the 29th of November last year. And it's a collection of essays in which 7 of Eli's pieces appear. And he has several other books forthcoming in 2023. His areas of academic expertise are the politics of the founding era of the United States, the intersection of demagogues and democracy, and the ethics of constitutional democracy. So Eli, your work is fascinating and obviously very topical, and it's a great privilege to speak with you today. So this book, which I had the pleasure of reading, is a collection of 32 essays by 22 writers that makes the case that the pathway back to a healthy democracy in America is for citizens first to understand demagogues and second to defend against them. And we've discussed the topic of demagoguery and President Trump in the United States previously on the speaker series, first in September 2020 with Eric Posner, and then again in October of 2020 with both Eric Posner and Jack Goldsmith. So it's great to be returning to this topic, particularly as the political context has changed so much since those discussions took place. So before we get into specifics, Eli, I wonder if you'd like to generally tell us more about this important book.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me, Donna. And I know you had done one prior show on demagogues. I didn't know you had done 2, so I want to thank you. You're an outlier as someone who seems to really understand, as I do, and I'll talk about the book, that demagogues are something that we need to study and hear about, not once, not twice, or even 3 times, but constantly. So in some ways, you asked me about the book. It is a book, as you mentioned, it is a book. It's a collection of essays by 22 different authors. And I would say what unites all of the essays, and 7 of them are by me, as you'd mentioned too, is that they all act together to sound an alarm about demagogues in democracies. Demagogues are unique to democracies. And there's a tradition in the United States, and perhaps in Europe, of using the term demagogue as an epithet or an insult. You know, the person's a demagogue, as one misunderstanding of really what the importance of the word demagogue. And another is to think of a demagogue as a gadfly, you know, these pesky, loudmouthed politicians who sometimes annoy a democracy. But the real truth is there's a forensic importance to the term demagogue that goes back to ancient Athens and even before to Sparta, the concept of this individual. And it's so important to understand because it is the unique agent of destruction of democracies. And that happens in 2 ways. And the book captures this. So to summarize, you know, demagogues have a very baleful impact on democracies, for one, because the demagogue's first talent is the sad and tragic ability to gain power and fame through the use of divisive, bigoted, misogynist, xenophobic language. or speech. So the first danger that the demagogue poses to democracies is just dividing the people, causing hatred and fear-mongering within the voting populace and the rest of the populace. The second is, that's less well understood, is demagogues are very famous for coming in, once they achieve power, such as head of state or presidency, they are very famous for continuing their demagoguery, but also devolving into authoritarianism. The idea to understand there would be a demagogue is a corrupt individual who lacks a moral compass. And once they come into power, they're intoxicated on power, as a wise person from your nation, Lord Acton, describes as, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I would say that power really corrupts demagogues. And so, as we witnessed with Trump, he devolved into authoritarianism. He summoned a mob to the Capitol on January 6th and attempted to stage what's called an auto coup, which is a fun term that we're all learning as a product of what Trump tried to do here. So the last thing I'll say about the book is that it's not the most popular book on the market. It's not the highest selling book on the market. Those credits go to books like Bob Woodward's books on Trump. And by that, I mean about Trump. But I do, with attempted objectivity, say it is the most important book on the market with regard to Donald Trump and who he is. And that's because it deeply links Trump and what's happened to our democracy over the past 6 or 7 years to a long history of 2,500 years in the understanding of demagogues and the way they can and do bring down democracies.
It's a very interesting book, and I really would encourage everyone to read it. And you've touched there on the definition of a demagogue, but maybe just to go into more detail, if you would like, I will just read a short quote from the introduction in the book, if that's okay. So you write that since Donald J. Trump announced his candidacy for president in June 2015, commentators and analysts have been fumbling for the right word to describe him. So some refer to Trump as an authoritarian in one breath, and in the next as an autocrat. Others jump from strongman and dictator to fascist and tyrant as they search for the most accurate term. Ultimately, the problem with these labels is not that they are wrong about the underlying potentialities of the 45th president. The tragedy of these descriptors is that they lack the precision we need in an enlightened democracy to identify and rectify the system flaws that led to Trump's rise to power in the first place. So I suppose apart from what you've discussed in answer to the first question, what in your view defines a demagogue and why is that important?
I think the first thing I would say with regard to this important question of what is a demagogue, what's the definition of a demagogue, is it changes over time slightly. There's some core features that are maintained, but originally the term applied to a leader of the people. And that sounds like a glorified and positive thing, but what it really meant is a leader that uses the people to achieve personal ends and to self-aggrandize self. So I think at the simplest form of understanding of what a demagogue is, it is a orator. I will suggest that the media individuals in democracies, Tucker Carlson for one, Alex Jones for another, they are absolutely classic demagogues as well, even though they're not in politics. They are participating in the democracy, using oratory to do so. So, but back to an orator who uses specifically division, fear-mongering, hate-mongering, almost always sort of xenophobic messaging, and sometimes racism, in order to split the people. And the purpose behind that is, for the demagogue, to some extent, it's letting out the negative energy within the demagogue. But the ultimate aim is to gain power for oneself and adulation and the type of absolute clinging adoration and love that Trump has right now. in the United States with his base. Millions of people love him as though he's a god. So that, in a way, is one of the underlying drives of what we could call the demagogic personality. Now, with regard to authoritarianism, what I believe is that every demagogue has a latent authoritarian within him or her. It's just there within the personality. Every authoritarian, it's important to recognize, does not have the skills of the demagogue, which is just sometimes, and Trump has this for his base. I mean, mesmerizing ability to speak for 2 hours without any notes. So Trump is really a remarkable speaker. As far as demagogic skills go, Trump is a genius. So I'll just sort of just the quick definition is a political leader or an orator in a democracy who uses divisive, bigoted oratory in order to gain power and fame. And Trump is also, it's not wrong to say Trump is an authoritarian. It may have been challenging to say that before January 6th happened.
Yeah.
And certainly the January 6th committee, which just recently released its report, has really demonstrated to us that Trump is an authoritarian through its findings. But why I think the word demagogue is so important is two reasons. One, it really describes how this type of political personality gets into power through demagoguery in a healthy democracy. And also it's the term that if we Google or what people used to do, go to the library and do research and look at books, you're going to find a wealth of information out there about demagogues in democracy. That, again, as I've mentioned several times, goes back thousands of years. Whereas if you use terms like populist or authoritarian, you're going to come up extremely short. You're not going to really gain deep historical understanding. So it's okay with me to call Trump a demagogue. It's also okay with me to call Trump an authoritarian demagogue. If someone just calls him an authoritarian, I think we're missing an opportunity to educate the public and ourselves about really the nature of the beast here.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about that distinction, because when we had these initial discussions in autumn of 2020, we talked about Trump as a demagogue, but maybe not quite meeting the definition of the traditional definition of an authoritarian or a fascist. It's really interesting to hear you say that after January the 6th, you would quite confidently call him an authoritarian.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting to see that development over time, but it's also, quite shocking. It's such a dangerous type of personality, isn't it? And so frightening to think that somebody like that was able to yield or wield so much power.
And I alluded to this a bit earlier, but what I'm a historian. I practiced medicine, psychiatry for 20 years, and some 5 or 6 years ago, I turned back to my original love, which is history. And I wouldn't be writing about politics, I think, if I didn't perceive this sense of danger in our democracy. But the fascinating thing about the January 6th findings and the whole trajectory of Trump is it ties, you can just take current events in the United States with Trump, and then you compare that backwards throughout history with the history of demagogues, and you find, wow, the intelligence of history is really stands out. But most significantly, I'm going to be giving some talks, one of which is entitled Alexander Hamilton's Theory of Democratic Collapse. So most of the founders were very concerned with demagogues. But Alexander Hamilton in particular was very interested in this. He spoke at length about it in the Constitutional Convention, and afterwards he wrote about it in more than one Federalist paper. But the theory, Alexander Hamilton's theory of democratic collapse, just to use his brief phrase, which we've seen repeated in a lot of press, that these types of personalities like Trump commence demagogues and they end tyrants. So that's just another way of restating what I said earlier. That is Alexander Hamilton's theory of democratic collapse, and it's worth repeating. Demagogue comes into power as a damaging demagogue, but then worsens with power, does not want to give up power, so resorts to more desperate means, including more demagogic desperate means, and also authoritarian means, in order, in this instance, not to give up power. So it's such a joy when a principle or a concept from history just materializes in a colorful manner before our very eyes. So I'm both fascinated by what's happened to my country over the past 7 years and very frightened by it. It's very tragic, but at the same time, when I could put on that objective historian's hat, it's just completely fascinating.
And just before we move on to the next question, I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about Trump being able to speak for 2 hours without notes. He's obviously intelligent, but a lot of people would perceive him as lacking intelligence. Do you think that he's intentionally put on this kind of cloak of the demagogue? He's understood what those skills and characteristics are and he's adopted them? Or do you think that that comes naturally to him, or is it impossible to say?
I don't think it's impossible to say. I think that the vast majority of Trump's behavior is deeply embedded in his personality.
Yeah.
So in many ways, he cannot do other than what he is doing. However, as Trump manifests himself and he sees that it produces results, it leads to greater adulation, it leads to greater power, or I don't think in these instances it's led to greater wealth, but perhaps it has. Mm-hmm. Certainly, like, I'll put it this way with no disrespect to Donald Trump, like any of us, human beings are animals, we learn what works and it sets off dopamine in our minds. And so we learn we're going to repeat that again with the hopes that it will produce the same results.
Yeah.
And Trump's doing that now. And to the good fortune of the United States, his old bag of tricks, which again are inveterate, I think, and programmed in him, they're not working as well. I don't want to suggest that the danger of Trump is mitigated, because he has surprised us way too many times. But certainly there is a decreasing lack of interest and willingness to embrace Trump and for the media to cover a lot of his antics. That
has quietened down to the relief of many. And so if we've spoken about the definition of a demagogue and Trump as a demagogue, what do you think then is the value of understanding and recognizing demagoguery for the general public and for the experts like yourself?
Well, I think by far the most important reason for recognizing demagogues, understanding demagogues, and then critically acting to defend democracy against demagogues is that demagogues can be fatal to democracies. I like to think of, we have healthy functioning democracies, and in spite of their many defects, like our own, that it has, at least in the dominant operations of the government structure, it has ethical and democratic norms of operation. And as we have seen, just again with bright lights flashing for us to learn from, a demagogue travels, I think, with a couple of companions. I think of these three troubadours traveling together. It's demagoguery, corruption, and authoritarianism. They all sort of intermix. So, and I'm glad you asked me that question, because it really enables me to just reiterate, kind of say, let's sound the alarm again, that demagogues are not playthings of democracy. They're not gadflies. They are mortal threats to democracy. And Trump, for example, I thought several years ago about writing a piece that made allusion to Trump being an enemy of the Constitution. And I thought, that's not our political tradition to call the President of the United States an enemy of the Constitution. So I held off. But now I'm very comfortable saying that. Again, after witnessing and understanding January 6th and his continuation of the big lie, and importantly, again, to celebrate the January 6th Select Committee, it is really impossible for an objective observer to deny that Trump, in some ways due to no fault of his own, he is not in control of himself. He is an enemy of the Constitution because the Constitution stands in the way of his power and glory. And I'll just quickly tell you an image that frequently comes to my mind, and just came to it now. If we think of what a constitutional democracy is, I actually do find myself thinking of a beautiful throne room like the old throne rooms in Great Britain used to be. I don't think they're quite as elaborate now, but with red, velvet tapestries in the background and a big, beautiful throne and scepters and maybe guards standing beside it. But what's in the center of the throne is a constitution. And what happens with someone like Trump, and is part of this corrupting process of descending from demagoguery into authoritarianism, is Trump and others like him, they cannot stand that constitution that's sitting in that throne. And they want more than anything to just go to that throne, grab that constitution, tear it up, and sit down. And not be a good limited king like you all have in Britain, but be an absolute monarch is the drive and the desire.
The absolute power, yeah.
So that's a fun way I think of the problem of demagogues.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to think of it in lighter ways, so as not to feel too threatened by the whole thing.
Humor saves us, right?
Exactly, yeah. And we might talk about solutions later on, but before we do, I was interested to read in the book how you discuss the idea that stable and functional democracies are degraded by demagogues in a kind of a two-step process. Would you like to elaborate further on those two steps?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I've spoken to that, but just in brief,
Sure, yeah.
I will say I do like the concept of saying, look, what happens with demagogues, there is a two-step process. Yeah. The first step is the talented but destructive demagogue using the oratorical skills we've spoken of, the dark arts of oratory that we've spoken of. Unfortunately, if not successfully blocked by wiser individuals within the democracy, gains high office. And of course, the most destructive office to gain is the presidency. And then I won't say too much more about it, but then the second step is described in Hamilton's two-step sort of collapse of democracy, devolves into authoritarianism and attempts to overthrow governments, overthrow constitutions as a more obvious authoritarian. Those are the two steps. Step one, demagogue. Step two, authoritarianism. And they're both very destructive to democracies. The second step, even more than the first step, obviously the attempt to overthrow the government and remove democracy and neutralize or destroy constitutions is the ultimate insult and the most fatal thing that can happen to what might have been a robust, healthy democracy beforehand.
Right. Yes. Thank you so much. It's interesting. I would encourage everyone to read the book if you get a chance, because there's a really interesting exploration of all of the issues that we're discussing here. So Eli, you wrote a piece in the New York Times that was then published as part of this collection, where you talk about whether the founders would convict Trump if they were here and alive and in power today. Would you like to talk a bit more about that?
Sure. I had the great fortune to have spent intensively the past 5 years researching a history book that's coming out in June of next year called Disunion Among Ourselves, The Perilous Politics of the American Revolution. Now, everyone knows the American Revolution was before the Constitutional Convention in 1787, but I have also done some writing in an academic manner about the Constitutional Convention. So the thing that's to my good fortune is I feel very close to 6 or 7 of the founders and feel like I really know their thinking and who they were very well. And to a lesser degree, all of the 55 delegates who participated in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And they certainly had their tremendous blind spots in areas of sort of unacknowledged corruption, mainly relating to slavery and a very different form of democracy than that deprived so many of participation. But within the operation of government and the way they conducted themselves with one another, and their classical reading of Greek, Rome, and other history, they were really profound historians themselves. It is clear to me that if those 55 delegates were magically transported to our time in a thought experiment, that they would categorically say this is exactly what we built the Constitution to withstand, is a demagogue who has these authoritarian tendencies. So I actually believe that it might be unanimous, but to be a little humble, in the piece, I said that I felt certain that the founders of the country, if called upon to vote as senators in the Senate in the trial to convict Trump, they would nearly unanimously vote to convict, and then they would also nearly unanimously vote to permanently disbar Trump from future federal office, which a lot of people don't know. We tend to think of, impeachment is decided in the House of Representatives and the Senate decides on conviction. There is another clause of the impeachment powers of the Constitution which enable them to permanently disband or permanently disbar demagogue or authoritarian like Trump from future federal office. And I do, as one of the pieces in the collection describes, in some ways I really feel that the first tragedy, the first most severe tragedy of Trump's presidency, or of our current times, was the January 6th riot and insurrection. And then I'm a little bit alone in another deep sense of tragedy, and that is that 57 senators only in February of 2021, soon after the January 6th event, voted. It's a pretty respectable number. That's quite a bipartisan number. We just needed 10 more. And so, as one of these pieces laments, I'm not one who holds a grudge against people, but I'm still dealing with a great sense of pain that 10 more senators, Republican senators, did not convict Trump and permanently prevent him from pursuing federal office. Just 10 individuals who, if they had acted more out of conscience and moral courage instead of partisanship, and maybe I will give them the credit, maybe they don't understand demagogues, they don't understand authoritarianism, they didn't understand that if Trump has another presidency, it could be much more detrimental. So that's my belief there. So, but in the piece, yes, it's just, I'll just sum that back to the New York Times piece. I basically show that the founders were very united in wanting to keep demagogues and other malefactors like demagogues from gaining the presidency in particular, and they made very clear they were building a government that would only work if we had ethical leadership within the government. That's something that I'll comment a little bit more on. I think people just think, well, what we need is a democracy, and democracy works. We have the will of the people, and somehow through a magic wand or invisible hand, having a democracy leads to good government. Very untrue. The next layer on top of that is, oh, okay, well then we need a constitutional democracy. I would say, well, that's right. That makes democracy a lot better, to have those built-in structures with what we think of as political institutions, separation of powers, and checks and balances. But it's still not enough, as we've learned here with Trump. You also need leadership of conscience and ethical leadership. So my formula for good government is ethical, constitutional democracy, not constitutional democracy, but ethical constitutional democracy. In fact, I'm willing and bold enough to say that the source of political happiness, the formula for political happiness, is ethical constitutional democracy. We need all three pieces.
Right. Interesting. Thank you. And before I move on to the next question, I'm just curious in relation to, you speak about these potential 10 people who could have declared an impeachment, but those voices were absent. Do you think that was purely partisanship at play, or was there anything else, do you think, at play at that time leading to that outcome?
I think I like complexity, and I want to think, on the one hand, those 10 or more, let's see if we do the math, 43 of them perhaps are not well read in history. 43 of them perhaps do not really understand what a demagogue is. 43 of them perhaps do not understand this two-part process. that we've discussed and that we can call Alexander Hamilton's theory of democratic collapse. I think that's a piece of it. My guess is that's a piece of it.
Yeah.
But there is so much more. And I think to try and be charitable to those individuals, fear, many manifestations of fear plays a very critical role. Frankly, fear of Donald Trump and fear of loss of election, and also fear of loss of community. Most of us are siloed here into Democratic and Republican parties. So when I think of a lot of those individuals, I think some of them worried that they would be castigated by their own spouse if they voted to convict Trump. I think some of them would worry about being kicked out of organizations that they're in. Some of them may worry they would become persona non grata at their country clubs. So it is ultimately, I think you can put it under the rubric of partisanship, but I think we need to do more of this in our analysis of democracy and how people behave in democracies. We really need to get at some of the personal and group psychology of what's causing these things. So I have written those 43 senators. We need to forgive them, but we can never forget the egregious mistake that they made. They had in their hands the power to remove Donald Trump permanently from threatening our democracy again, other than being kingmaker. But he probably would lose the power to be kingmaker, in fact, if he had undergone that stringency by our federal government.
Yeah, and that's the importance, I suppose, of books like yours in helping people to understand, especially helping people in power to understand the consequences of demagoguery. Because if they would be willing to put partisanship and possibly psychological fears aside on the grounds that they understood the very severe consequences of the demagogue, then the education of the public in regard to what a demagogue is so crucial.
And it's remarkable to think, and the education of our political leaders. There was a time perhaps where we thought, they were the role models,
right,
and they were the educators. I still would love to go back to that, where they're educating the public about how democracy works. But look, if we're not fortunate enough to be in that situation, I actually, as a person who practiced medicine for 20 years, I had to every year do something called continuing medical education, which was 50 hours of added education. So I'd like to see something called, continuing constitutional education be required for every member of our House of Representatives and for every senator it would be put together either somewhat at random or through a nonpartisan group. And it seems critically necessary now that we do this, and we could have the courses for them on moral courage. I know that might sound condescending, but if they already know, they don't know more about moral courage than our nation's experts on moral courage. So let's bring in the experts to educate them about this and to maybe trigger a deep sense of the way they could really serve their country by accessing moral courage. Moral courage is a very difficult thing to accomplish for a person, and I think more so for a politician. But the greatest things in our society, and probably most, have come from moral courage and civic virtue in political leaders. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Absolutely, and I think many constitutional democracies could benefit from that type of continuing education.
Yes.
So moving on then to the essay that you contributed in relation to what you believe Trump's place in history is. I know you've touched on that already, but is there anything else you'd like to say on that topic?
Well, I think if I just at least paraphrase the headline or title of that piece, I think it captures it. It says, I think the title was "Trump is the Supreme American Demagogue." This is true. I mean, Trump will be, I have no doubt, the most illuminating case study in United States history, certainly, for understanding a demagogue. We've had other demagogues. We've had other dangerous demagogues, but the unique thing some of the demagogues that we've had, if they had achieved the Oval Office, potentially could have been more destructive than Trump. But the key thing is Trump got into the Oval Office. This is the unique feature of Trump. He is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the first full-fledged demagogue who has reached the Oval Office. Eric Posner, in his book, which I know you spoke with him, he somewhat proposes that actually Andrew Jackson was a demagogue and maybe the first demagogue. I think he's quite alone in that assessment. Andrew Jackson definitely had some demagogic qualities. But if we grade demagogues, Andrew Jackson, 0 to 10, Andrew Jackson might have reached a 5 or 5.5, and Trump hits, he bursts the bubble at 10, and it goes out, beyond that. So I think he will go down in our history as the supreme American demagogue, and that the other most, famous demagogues in our history, Huey Long and Senator Joe McCarthy, they will pale in comparison. I say they're going to be footnotes compared to Trump.
Yeah. Well, it will be interesting to see what happens next.
I'll say, in addition to that, I will say that when the demagogue is operating, it's an extremely partisan affair. But 20 to 30 years out, as long as the democracy recovers, if it continues a death spiral, remains in kind of demagogic authoritarianism, then history won't be able to alter, and proper judgment of history and perspective will not come about.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say there is that today, Huey Long, Father Coughlin is one of my most interesting demagogues in U.S. history, and Joe McCarthy, they were extremely partisan in their day, and almost everyone now agrees these individuals were classic textbook demagogues. So that's heartening to know. If we do recover in 20 or 30 years, Republicans and Democrats alike are going to be saying, wow.
You're going to agree, yeah.
You truly was the supreme American demagogue.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So you also have an essay in the collection on the topic of Trump's impeachment acquittal. Now, I know we've spoken about that. Is there anything else on in the content of that essay that you would like to draw out that hasn't been discussed so far? Or will we move on?
No, I think we've covered that.
Yeah.
I think it really it brings up more deeply the needs for reform. Basically, what we learn is, and we begin to look at, if we posit that, I'm just going to simplify, the purpose of a good constitutional structure surrounding a democracy, the purpose of that is to keep demagogues out of the position of the presidency and the head of state. I know people say, what do you mean? The purpose of the Constitution is just that? There are many other purposes, but I just want to say the most important purpose of the constitutional structure that surrounds a democracy is to keep demagogues and authoritarians out of positions of power. So then when we look at we'll talk maybe about solutions. When we look at ways to do that, you can prevent that individual, most importantly, by far, prevent the individual from getting into what in our country is the Oval Office or the White House. But once they're there also are remedies. The founders drafted these complicated impeachment powers and Senate's powers for conviction to remove someone like Trump. So there's opportunity to reform. So much failed in American democracy. And hopefully we're going to find success with this last component of American democracy, which is the rule of law, which you're very aware and others are aware. Trump has at least 3 to 4 cases against him now. And hopefully the new special counsel who's been appointed by Merrick Garland named Jack Smith is going to find that Trump is criminally liable for the reasons that the January 6th committee laid out, which we could touch on if you wanted. But so hopefully the rule of law is going to step in here. There's many ways to defeat the demagogue or preserve the democracy in the face of the demagogue, and most of them have failed miserably. And we can talk about I hope we'll talk about the most important reform, which is political parties are obligated to block demagogues from emerging from them as candidates for president.
Right.
It's, to me, the most essential thing that a political party does is it brings forth constitutional candidates. So that's my elaboration on that piece.
Great. No, I think we should definitely come back to that question of solutions. And when you mentioned there the cases against Trump on the possibility for criminal liability, there would have been so many people in attendance and watching our seminar back from 2020 who would have been just very joyous about that thought, but it wasn't known at that time, but it's very interesting to see that unravel and develop. So I suppose we've touched on very much your essay discussing democracy's survival depends on fighting demagogues in terms of what threats do demagogues pose and what are the advantages of preventing their rise to power. But if you like, we could maybe talk about solutions. What happens next for America? What's the future potentially of demagoguery, or the prevention of demagoguery? And has the Trump presidency established a precedence? Do you think, might we expect further demagogues? You've already touched on that. And you've also written a New York Daily piece, which is included in the collection in relation to America, hopefully not re-electing a demagogue in the future. So I suppose we could talk about solutions at this point, if you like. You've already mentioned one very important one, but is there anything else you'd like to discuss in relation to solutions and prevention of the rise to power of demagogues?
Well, I can express my hope that after this tragic experience that the entire nation has had, even though some would not characterize the causation the same way I do, this tragic experience we've had of demagoguery and authoritarianism, the best outcome possible for this type of crisis and crisis of confidence is reform. And I believe that democracy is resilient. However, democracy is not resilient without reform. So I put the entirety of my hope in, and I'm not sure the degree to which the current constitution of our democracy and of our two dominant political parties will facilitate this, because they need to have some flexibility. But to some extent, reform is in the air in the United States now. And I want to do my small part to really encourage reform as the solution, if there is one, or the solutions. And so I have a number of ideas. We talked about some small, improbable ideas, such as continuing constitutional education for our elected representatives. The most critical reform that we need to have in our country, and the most obtainable by far, is reform of our presidential nominating system. I'm going to be brief, but I could be long on this. But I'll be brief simply by saying that for 200 years of our history, more or less, political parties elected or nominated, voted in presidential candidates, and then the people voted on the dominant candidates, normally from two parties, but sometimes from more. During another period of crisis in our history, which was right at the period of high tension, high pain, and high protests surrounding the Vietnam War, the Democratic Party led the country in the late 1960s and early 1970s in making dramatic changes to the way that we nominate presidents, and essentially became a direct democratic vote of the presidential candidates. Again, not in the general election, president. That's been, again, more or less a direct democracy vote. Right. But really an understandable, but really, I think, a reckless mistake was made at that point by some very smart people. And they entirely removed the ability by now of the political parties to block demagogues and authoritarians. So our political parties now, and in particular the Republican Party after Trump, are extraordinarily weak parties. So the most important reforms relate to political parties, getting strength back to our political parties and coming up with creative ways. We could either go back to the system where the political parties pick the presidential candidates, and the people pick the president. If there is a great desire for the people to be involved in the picking of the presidential candidates, there are creative ways that this could be done, but somehow or another, through creative means, the conventions which nominate presidents could have a power. All countries have veto powers of different kinds. So it is my belief that these political parties need to step up, regain their strength, and they need, even if it's through an inter-party compact, to say to the world and to say to any candidate who wants to come near their political party this: we adhere by a strict litmus test, and that litmus test is that we will under no circumstances advance a candidate through our nominating convention that doesn't formally acknowledge that they will uphold the Constitution if they become president of the United States, that they will uphold their oath of office, that they will uphold free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power, that if they lose an election, they will make a concession speech and they will call the other candidate and congratulate them. Now, is this a constitutional power? No, but it is a litmus test that those delegates deciding who their nominee is should do this. And I don't think it would be beyond the pale to also have the candidates sign a formal document stating they not only do they understand these things, but they were vigorously going to put Constitution and country and the various things I listed earlier before their own self-interest. And even you have a party saying you must put Constitution above our party interest. That's the most important reform. And the way, I don't know if you're probably not aware, but for the first time in years, I don't know when the time before this is, the Republican Party in 2020 had no platform. Well, why? I mean, Trump doesn't like anything that controls him. So just to elaborate a little more on this current area of interest and research, the political parties, we elect delegates. The delegates should go to the conventions and first adopt their party platforms, describing who they are, what they want to be, what they want to represent to the nation, and what they want their voters to know about them. And then once they establish the party platform, they decide what candidate is going to the best of their abilities to determine is going to fulfill the tenets and premises within that party platform. I can't say if they had done it this way that Trump ever would have been president. In fact, if the parties had been strong, Trump never would have been president in 2016.
Right.
It is an impossibility. But all of those delegates, I'll demonstrate by moving forward. All of those delegates had their hands tied behind their backs, because by convention now, not necessarily rules and regulations of all the parties, they go in and they are bound to vote for whatever president the voters selected. And so I'll stop with this. If in the state of California or another one, I'm in California now, I was a delegate, and let's just hypothetically say that the people voted for Stalin. But they're voting for me to go and represent them in the convention. I would, by today's conventions and requirements, I would have to vote for Stalin. Right. This is a dreadful, dreadful way to organize a democracy.
And I mean, they're very good ideas for reform. But what do you think is the likelihood of those reforms being implemented? Do you think there's more of an appetite for that kind of thing after Trump as there might have been before?
Very much greater appetite after Trump. There is no doubt. I know that people, particularly within the Republican Party, are trying to figure out what their rules should be and how the presidential nominating system should operate. In some ways, I am more interested in the right ideas that will save our democracy than feasibility, but I picked this one because it is the most feasible area of reform, primarily for this reason, which a lot of people don't understand. Our general election for the president is governed by the Constitution and a large body of laws. The nomination of presidential candidates, in fact, is something that a private organization does. Political parties are not governmental structures whatsoever. They are private organizations
Mm.
and private associations. So they actually are not under, other than not violating the Constitution, they're not under a body of specific laws that requires them to do one thing or the other. We do have a mess of things now. And so the problem with reforming our political parties today is some would call out that it's anti-democratic. But the best answer to give to that is this is a very dangerous system, and democracy is equally about checks and balances on demagoguery and abuse of power as it is about the will of the people. Now, that's a bold statement. Everyone thinks democracy is about the will of the people, and it is 100%.
Mm.
But I'm going to also say the success of a democracy is 100% also about checks and balances against abuse of power and the development of authoritarianism within a government. So we have to learn that we have layers of democracy. And again, my motto for this is let the parties pick the candidates, let the people pick the president.
Right.
So if that's not enough democracy for some people, then we would just have a difference of opinion. I would say that my only reason for having an interest in the party picking the candidates is this check on demagogues.
Yeah. No, I mean, the will of the people is such an important concept, but what's the value in it if there aren't checks and balances on the person who holds the power once the will of the people has been voiced?
Well, and then what you find just tremendously with demagogues who evolve into authoritarianism is the will of the people elects the demagogue. The demagogue goes in, ransacks the democracy, and strips the people of their power.
Right. Yeah.
It's tragic, but it's remarkable that the trust is placed in an individual who goes on to strip you of your most sacred rights and freedoms. That is what happens. That is what happens in Hamilton's two-step process of his theory of the collapse of democracies.
So the more we know about demagoguery and what demagogues do to achieve these outcomes, the better, hopefully, then for the future of democracy.
And we won't go into too much, but the other thing we need to reform is the media. The media has become, to some extent, profit-fueled demagoguery itself. Some media are certainly worse than others.
Yeah.
And I was much gratified to read through the recent report submitted by the January 6th Select Committee. I was very dissatisfied with their small section on reforms, but very satisfied that they said one of the things we need to do in this nation and in the Congress is we need to study, their exact words were, the role of the media in contributing to the January 6th insurrection. So I embrace that wholeheartedly. We have free speech problems, etc., but I think we have to take seriously and find a way to both support free speech, but also to mitigate the presence of demagoguery in our lives everywhere, and most notably coming from the news media, not just the media, but the news media.
Right. That's very progressive, actually. I didn't realize that was included in the report. So it's interesting to see that. And I think other constitutional democracies could learn from that type of process too. Well, I think we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to Dr. Eli Merritt. Thank you to everybody for watching this talk. Eli, you're obviously a very influential thinker and a prolific scholar. We're looking forward to seeing your publications in 2023. Including the book you mentioned, Disunion Among Ourselves. Would you remind me of the full title of that so that the listeners can
Disunion Among Ourselves, The Perilous Politics of the American Revolution, which just in 400 pages demonstrates how absolutely challenging it was for these 13 dissimilar colonies to come together and form one government. They really worried they were going to fall into civil war and cut one another's throats. So it's remarkable to discover how we tend to think of that as a time of harmony of a band of privileged white males. They had as much animosity and struggle with one another as any period of history I've seen.
I'm very much looking forward to reading that, and we'll keep an eye out for it in 2023. So the book, and if you want to hold it up again, feel free. The book we've spoken about today, it touches on very important issues relating to leaders, in particular demagogues in the modern era. We have been delighted to have the opportunity to hear your views on this subject today, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to talk again. Is there anything else that you'd like to raise, Eli, before we wrap up for today?
No, I just want to appreciate you again, Donna, for having me, but again, notably for taking an interest in a subject matter that is so important. You are unique, I think, in recognizing that we all need to study and understand these concepts more. It's
been wonderful, and I've no doubt that this will be a very popular talk, and I hope that you continue to educate the public on the issue of demagoguery, and I hope that we have the opportunity to speak again. So with that, I'll close the session. Thank you again, Dr. Merritt.
Thank you, Donna.